Jakob Aagaard, a name I am sure I am pronouncing incorrectly, is a Northern European chess grandmaster and widely considered one of the better trainers in the world, if you know, one of the best. And he's written a very highly regarded series working towards improving at a high level. Many chess books are aimed because at weaker levels because that's where there's going to be a lot more people. And he's one of the few people who has really built up books based on trying to improve you with challenging stuff and prose that helps you understand it. And I haven't gotten into them, though I really would like to someday. But it is highly regarded stuff. I think he's clearly one of the three or four best chess authors going, and that might be underselling it, and one of the best trainers around. Now, he has three questions he uses to try to help people get better at positional chess. And I want to try to port them over to Triple Triad. And today we'll be looking at the first question and moving it over. And this isn't quite the argument he makes, but I want to make an argument for questions in general, which is when you start on a game, it's helpful to have some rules. It's helpful, like, hey, when you can lock in a card, lock it in, right? Like, some players, like at the start, you're kind of just capturing things and you don't realize, hey, this capture is less valuable than this other capture because that one locks something in. And this one doesn't actually, I mean, it just flips a card that is going to flip back at some point unless I spend another turn later locking it in if they haven't done so before me. And so there are kind of these rules you can learn, and they can be more complex than that. I think one of my favorites is if there's three cards in a line, say in one, two, and three. So say starter in one, second turn captured in two. If you play in three and don't flip two or interact with two or one, but you are safe in three and one or two are vulnerable, it is probably even to a slight advantage to first turn. First turn is down 6-4, but they have the only safe card on the board, and that tends to be worth slightly more. Usually it's second turn that has to be a little careful there, not first turn. And I think this is a really useful guideline because if someone captures your starter, normally you want to recapture it. But if for some reason the recaptures aren't working, this gives you a second plan to look for that you really don't have to calculate much to know is at least all right. All you have to do is find safety. You don't really have to look further to know this is probably fine to good for me. Obviously, more calculation does help, but it's really helpful to have that guideline and know these positions are generally sound. I should not be in much trouble. And I think stuff like that is useful rules, right? And there's lots of other ones. And the nice thing about Triple Triad is everyone has their own terminology and their own thoughts about stuff. So you surely have your own that like no one else has in the same words. I'm probably the only one that has bullied people through these videos into sharing some of my words for stuff. Though, of course, people converse and there's shared language. But in general, we all sort of have our own little descriptions of stuff, and there's not a normalized language about it. And so everyone's also going to have their kind of own rules and guidelines. But a different thing you can do than rules or guidelines, and it works a little similarly, but I think it can help at a more advanced level especially, is questions. Things you ask yourself that can direct your thinking, right? And this could be simple. This could be like, what can I do to interact with their corner starter should I want to? Or it could be stuff like I ask myself at the start of every game. I guess this isn't really a question in the same way, but I go, what is my opponent's supercard? What's their strongest in each direction? And that helps me think about the game going forward, right? I can there's not some rule about their supercard, but keeping in mind, oh, they have a little bit of a left weakness. Oh, they only have one card that has much going down. Okay, I'm going to keep that in mind while I think about other things, and that might help direct me, right? It is a useful tool. It does not send me to a move in itself. It does not tell me what to do, but it's going to guide my thought process between the other things I consider in a way I find useful. And so I think stuff like that it's not you must do this. It's, hey, here is something to keep in mind. And if we have a ton of things to keep in mind, that's going to be overwhelming. So I want to narrow it to a few things. Now, I like looking at their super card, but you only really do that on the first turn of the game, and then sort of have this mental ticker, hey, they used a card, have things changed for their directional weakness. But a lot of that can be done during the opponent's turn, right? A lot of keeping track of that. And I try not to think too much during the opponent's turn. I try to give myself a mental rest. But that's the kind of like, I don't have to calculate. I don't have to think much about moves. I can just be like, oh, hey, how'd their hand change? Oh, looks like it has less right power than it did before. Okay, good to know. And I don't have to do anything complicated. So it's a helpful question to ask there. And there's an easy time to insert that kind of thinking, right? If I'm on second turn, I can just do it during my opponent's first turn, right? And I'll be better prepared for my next turn. Okay, enough preamble. We'll move on to our second preamble. So, his first question is actually, I don't know the order he does, but let's say this was his first question. What is the worst placed piece? And there's a whole history of famous quotes in chess on this topic. Siegbert Terresch, who was one of the best players of the 1890s and 1900s, I would suggest he probably peaked second or third in the world before some really good players came in the late 1900, 1910 area. Maybe not. He played a world championship match, which he did not play particularly well by his standards, but he played a bunch of other matches with other top players and tended to at least tie those matches. And I think he's one of the best players in the world for a 20-year stretch, which is very impressive, even if he was never quite competing for that top spot. Though, of course, he did play a world championship match, so he did literally compete for that top spot. But he has a quote that sounds something like, I'm not going to have it exactly right. I should have, written it down or brought up the quote. But something like, if a piece stands badly, the position stands badly. And of course, you might think like, if you have, if you're, kind of the basics of how chess works, I could have a bad piece, but I have an extra queen, of course I'm going to win. But if you have an extra queen at that level, the opponent has resigned. There is no need to play more of that game. No useful advice will be given about that point in the game because you will A, trivially win those positions without advice, and B, will not have to play them because opponents will resign because it is so obvious that anyone remotely near this level could win consistently from that position. This is not to say at a beginning level you should resign those positions, because your opponent has serious chances to make sufficient mistakes. But so advice applies to like playing at your level kind of thing, right? You have a level position, a level-ish position, and he's saying if you have a badly placed piece, that is just a huge concession in your position, and you in fact do not have a good position. Of course, this isn't always going to be true, but interesting advice. About 50, 60 years later, no, 50 years, Svetozar Gligorich, which is a great name, I think he writes a book called I Play Against Pieces. And he basically argues that his kind of core stylistic trait, his strategy, is to restrict his opponent's pieces, give them as little activity as possible, and if he succeeds in doing that, he's going to win the game. And so there's this whole history of people saying don't have a poorly placed piece, inflict them on your opponent, which sounds kind of obvious, but they're nicely said quotes and they've resonated with people. Okay, that brings us to triple triad. What I want to use it to mean here, what I want this question of what is the worst placed piece, I want it to be what is our worst card? And I think this is usually very easy to answer. So I'm just taking the last two games I spoke about in videos. Or two of the last three, just not like cherry picking at all, just taking the last stuff I looked at. Though I did check for other examples and other recent games and stopped at these two because the next game didn't work so well for it. So you might argue a little cherry pick, but I'm just taking the two most recent games I've talked about. They're the ones in my head, the ones I can probably talk about somewhat accurately. And we can just look at Tezuka's hand. And I don't, incidentally, sorry for the poor screenshot. This is me screenshotting a video. So when I put up the video, quality lowers, and I didn't click the YouTube button saying put the visual settings higher. And then I take a screenshot of that. And so every stage, the visual quality gets worse because I'm lazy. So apologies if the quality on this screenshot isn't great. That said, obviously these are games between great players. This is Tezuka versus Akiyama. But I think it shows how kind of easy it is to answer this question. What is the worst card in our hand? Right? Not on the board. This is a question about our hand. What is the worst card in our hand? And you can look at Tezuka's hand, and you can look at a few things, right? There's a few ways to kind of think about this. You could look at the board, right? What stuff in our hand attacks things on the board usefully? You could also look at the opponent's hand. What things in our hand play well against the opponent's hand? You might notice, hey, a 9 up is a lot better than a 5 up. It's much better than taking stuff on the board, but the 5 up can also actually take anything down facing in their hand. So depending where you look, you might draw different insights. But I think it's really hard to look at this position and not draw the conclusion that 2858 is the worst card in our hand. It has the least play in this position. Its only feature that isn't redundantly controlled in your hand is basically the 8 to the right. Now, that can capture the 7 and the 6. The 6 sometimes you can actually capture anyway with the 9519. So really the only thing it covers in the hand that the rest of the hand doesn't cover is 9447 happening to land in 8 or 9, which just from any kind of structural knowledge of the game, this is fairly unlikely to happen. And if it does happen, it is going to be essentially a non-capturing, non-interactive move, and you are likely to be well off. But yeah, so I think we can ask this question and just very easily get the answer, hey, 2858's the worst card in the hand. And that can direct our thinking, right? It might be easy to think, okay, 9519 and 5. That's the critical move, locking in more cards. Or 9519 and 6 until you notice it is plussed in 5. But 9519 and 5 looks like the critical thing to do. But it leaves you with cards that don't face the action here as well. So when I was commentating on this game, I was thinking, how can I use 2858 in a useful way? And I considered 7, and I ended up thinking 8 is the best move. 2858 and 8. It turns out I was wrong. 2858 and 8 I think is a pretty good move. It really sets up 5579 nicely, creating a threat in 7. It also plays really well in 9. 9519 is going to play well no matter what. It goes from a position where, hey, if we have to use 9519, sure we get some advantage on board, but the rest of our hand is really problematic. And that move has a tactical problem, 9519 and 5, because it flips 4. If our opponent plays 6, 8, 4, 6, and 7, that plus walls through 4 to flip 1. So there's tactical problems with that move too. But even if that move didn't lose, there would be a number of ties against it. And we can get significantly more pressure by keeping the more powerful cards and getting rid of the card that doesn't play well. This doesn't mean never play your big, powerful, high impact cards, try to save them for later, but it's worth noting 9519 is not going to run out of power, right? If it doesn't land in 5, it will have a double capture in 6 or a double capture in 9. Nothing can fight its mighty power, right? Going up left. But 2858 is going to have a lot of trouble finding a home. And so I came up with this idea of going in 8. Tezuka instead played her in 7. Noticing that if she's captured 6, 8, 4, 6, and 8, that actually sets up 5, 5, 7, 9 to have a devastating plus in 5. So he actually found an even more effective way to use her, setting up more things than just putting her in 8 did. And he went on to win this game. Though there was a tie available, it wasn't found by his opponent, and Tezuka goes on to win. And he goes on to win, in part, I'm sure he saw that 9519 and 5 or 6 didn't work and was looking for other options. But in part, I think both our instincts in this position was 2858 is the problem here. I need to get that out of my hand. As long as I have 2858 in my hand, I'm at risk, right? And if I can find a way to use 2858 usefully, then my position I stand very well. I have very good cards for this endgame. I think it's worth noting, once you identify the worst card, that doesn't mean you have to play it immediately. It could mean you find a way to set it up, right? It could be this card is poor now, but could be useful later, right? We could set it up such that it's good. I don't think there's a way to here, but it doesn't have to be, oh, I've identified the worst card, I have to use that now. And sometimes there are things on board that are just more important. But it's a useful question to kind of have in mind. What's the worst card? And having a sort of anxiety over holding on to that card for too long or leaving that card useless and dead for too long, I think is a really useful trait. And I think is a big part of why Tezuka was able to win this Christmas GB game. So let's move on to our second example. This is from Akiyama vs. Turds. And this one, Akiyama went on to win, but we will again be taking the position of his opponent. We will be taking the red hand of Turds. And I think, again, if I just ask the question, what is our worst card? It's a little more complicated here. I think there's a little more going on. But also, it's not like, I don't think you have to be a particularly strong player to go, okay, 8357 is pretty good. It's our only capture of 1 from 4. It has potential plus walls in 6. It faces the action well. It is kind of not redundant with our other cards. Yes, 8357 is a good and important card we should hold on to. Another card that I think strikes as fairly powerful here is 5188, has your only double capture in 2, and it's a powerful card relatively facing the action. Well, 5874 faces away from everything, right? 5874 has virtually no play on this board. 3688 has a little more. It has a capture in 2. It has a capture in 6, but most of your hand is captures in 6. And maybe, if you look a little further, you look at how the cards relate to the opponent's hand, maybe you come up with different things. So, in analysis afterwards, I think it was very clear that all of myself, Delial, and Turds, our instinct was the 3668 has to come out of the hand. We each suggested a move afterwards, and I didn't do deep analysis or anything, but the best move of those 3 was probably Deli's move of 3668 and 3, as in it gives the opponent the most losing replies, but that's not always that indicative. So he suggested 3668 and 3, I suggested 3668 and 6, and Turd suggested 3668 and 9. Now, these moves have different goals, right? Deli's move is specifically kind of creating threats around 2. My move is sort of making something I have an easy time taking back, and Turds' move sets up pluses for 5874 of same and a plus in 6, and a same in 8. So it's something of a setup move. These are quite different moves, but I think it's, telling that we all wanted to use the same card. Now, there's another card you could have easily identified as the worst card, and that's 5874. Now, it's a little clunky to find a way to use 5874. For instance, its weak corner in 9 is not actually easy for us to recapture. That's very clunky for us. It's actually got surprisingly high outfacing numbers for our hand to deal with. So I think what probably happened for all of us is we wanted to use the 5874. My guess is we all sort of thought that's the worst card, but none of us found a way to use it. And so instead, we looked for ways to use 3668, the next worst card, right? And of course, if we had found forcing lines, there could be other things that came up. But I think it's interesting that all of us here wanted to use the 3668. Now, I mentioned moves in 3, 6, and 9. The move Turds, in fact, played was 3, 6, 6, 8, and 7, which is all right, but put him in danger, and he couldn't find a tie the move after. But it is to say, all the moves we celebrated were with 3, 6, 6, 8. But what if we focused in on 5874? What if we said 5874 is our worst card, and we have to find a use for it? Right? We said it's mandatory to find a way to use the 5874 well. This is our worst card, everything else should play all right, but I just don't want to be left with this dead in my hand. One thing you might do is go to the move turds mentioned and say, okay, how can I set it up to be useful? 3, 6, 6, 8, and 9 sets up 5, 8, 7, 4 to have use in 6 and 8, right? I've turned it from being the worst card in my hand to being a pretty decent card. Now, if it ever lands in 6, it is susceptible to combos through 5. That's a kind of clunky interaction there. It's not fantastic, but we've set it up enough that it should be a decent card in our hand, and that should be sufficient. And that move does tie, though for what it's worth, all the moves I mentioned technically tie, but 3, 6, 6, 8, and 7, as we saw in the game, got in trouble, and I assume the other moves would have been difficult defenses as well, though again, I didn't investigate it too deeply. So one way to get the 5, 8, 7, 4 to be good that makes sense to me is 3, 6, 6, 8, and 9. Are there any other ways? Well, the conventional squares to go in here, if you want to go in 2 and 4, you usually don't want them to be able to combo through and flip your cards, so that's pretty clunky here. Um, are 6, 8, and 9. Now, 9, we just have so much trouble ever taking back. 6, we have really bad interactions with 6 too. These are difficult squares for us to play and have land solidly. For instance, if we go in 6, we have no recapture in 3 that isn't comboed from 2. That kind of thing. It's really clunky. 8, kind of a similar story. Our only recapture from 7 is 3, 6, 6, 8, which is real ugly. So it's hard to find a home. But if we were really specifically focusing on we have to find out a home that does something useful, one might alight on 5, 8, 7, 4, and 7. It gets this card out of our hand. Similar to Turds' move, it kind of says if you go in 4, I can combo through 5. You have to be very careful about my combos through 5. Because it sets up 5, 1, 8, 8, and 8, for instance, as the same. And so, that often gives up the 4 square, but here it's tricky to occupy the 4 square. It sets up this big threat in 8, and it gets the worst card out of our hand. And it's actually a winning reply. That move, if perfect play afterwards, that move wins the game. And I think it's a really difficult move to find. I think Turds going in 7 was actually remarkably close to this move. But the 5, 8, 7, 4 is just a really bad card. And in this specific situation, obviously, it's a very good card in general. And if you find a way to use it, sometimes you can do really surprising things, right? If you take your worst card and find a way to make it impact the board, that's going to seriously change things and could have won the game here. In a game, he ended up losing because I think Akiyama's move was actually very challenging and difficult to meet, and the win very hard to find. But these two games, I think both, you can look at these hands and you can pretty reasonably, in both cases, we can go back to the first case, you can go, yeah, what's Tezuka's worst card? Oh, it's definitely 2, 8, 5, 8. So maybe I was thinking about moves with 9, 5, 1, 9 and 5, for instance. Maybe I was thinking about 9, 5, 1, 9 in 9 because it's safe. Maybe I was thinking about ways to use my most powerful cards, but those moves aren't good. The best moves are to use our worst card, right? The best moves are to keep our more powerful cards for later. And even if that's not obvious at all, and I don't think it is very obvious that 2, 8, 5, 8, and 7 is the best move, and that 2, 8, 5, 8, and 8 is the second best move, I think that's not particularly obvious. But I think you don't have to be that strong to get there if we just ask this question of what's my worst card? That's really easy to answer. It's 2, 8, 5, 8. Can I find a way to use it? And maybe you come up with moves like 7 or 8 at that point, because where else are you going to put it, right? Once you've asked that question, I think you're going to end up on one of the two best moves a lot of the time. Even if someone's not a particularly strong player, I think just asking that question would make you have a really good chance to get to the right answers. If we look at this position, I think there's a lot of ways to go wrong and get in trouble. I think this is a really complicated position. We didn't go into the complications here, but I think there's a lot going on. Akiyama's move in 5 specifically created tons of threats in 2 and 4, because suddenly, if Akiyama takes, if Akiyama takes in 4, say with 8772, and you combo back with 8357 and 7, Akiyama combos back in 8 with 4686. And if Akiyama takes in 2 with 2768, which he actually did do on his next move, if you take back with 5188, you get comboed again by 4686 and 6. And so all your ways to combo back, you can flip back, but you can't combo back if he takes your starter. And so he created these really interesting threats. I think it's a really complicated move. We certainly aren't going to get into everything there, but we can sort of cut through all the complexity to, okay, this is a hard position to find a good move. What should we do? Well, we should do something that gets rid of one of our worst cards, or fixes the problem of one of our worst cards. And I think the move that's most likely to get you to is 3668 and 9, because it gets 3668 out of your hand, which is one of your two weaker cards, and it sets up 5874 to do something, right? So that feels a bit like a two birds with one stone situation, and I think that's probably the move you end up with. But there's also a chance, that you find 5874 and 7, and it would be pretty hard to find from most other starting thoughts. But if you're really like, 5874 is such a poor card, how can I get it out of my hand? And how can I make the rest of my hand happy once I do? Because once I get that out of my hand, I'm gonna not want to be going right at all, right? That card is by far my best card going right, and I'm gonna struggle in that direction. So how can I use 5874, get it out of my hand, and make the rest of my cards play well? I kind of got to put it somewhere on the left. And I think 5874 at that point becomes a possible move to find. I would not play it, right? I would not get to this move. This is a winning move. I would definitely miss it. It was missed by turds in this game. It was certainly missed by me in analyzing this game, but if I was playing, I also would have missed it. Sometimes there's differences there, because when you're playing, you do more specific calculation, and when you're commentating, you talk about whatever comes to mind. But I would have missed it both ways. This was a very strong move. If Akiyama saw it, he would not have played his move in 5, I believe, right? But it is possible to find, I think. And I think this would be one reasonable path to get there. So my thought here is maybe just regularly asking yourself, or getting used to integrating in your thinking. It doesn't need to be an explicit question, but just keeping in mind, what's my worst card, right? This is different than talk to your cards, right? It's different. You don't have to check in with all your cards, but just if one of your cards isn't doing much, if you look at your cards and you're like, every one of these is playing great, well, that's awesome. You probably have a great position, right? But if you look at your hand and there's one card that just sucks, keeping in mind, hey, that card sucks, might lead you to better thinking, right? It's not going to be a rule. It's not going to tell you you have to use that card now. It's not going to tell you you have to capture immediately or something like that. But keeping it in mind, I think, gives a chance to clarify how you should be thinking about the position. And that's how these questions are supposed to work. They're supposed to be much more useful for kind of people who are quite strong getting even stronger rather than beginners. But they're also questions you can give to beginners, and they will start to be able to answer more complex questions, right? They will, or start to find more complex moves, right? Especially, you go back to this previous game, like, what does a beginner do in this position? They play 9-5, 9-5-1-9 and 5 or 6, right? Maybe they play it in 7, right? They play one of the captures. Maybe they play something in 5. Any of the 3 cards in 5 is at least one capture. Maybe they play it in 6. Maybe they play it in 7. Maybe they go 9-5-1-9 and 9 because they notice that is safe. All of these moves are bad, right? The beginner, there are a number of possible moves a beginner might make here. All of them are bad. But I think you ask a beginner this question, and it would not take much to get them to the right move, right? With this thinking in their mind. And that, again, I think the nice thing about questions like this is they can lead a beginner to much more complex moves than they'd usually find, but they can also leave a strong player to better and more complex moves than they'd find as well. And so this was the first of my kind of stealing Jakob Aagaard's questions for chess and applying them to triple triad, and I think this one applies pretty well. The other 2 questions, just to say what they are, because I'm not sure I'll make videos about them, One is, what are the weaknesses? And I'm not sure how to define that for triple triad, right? You could define that as, what are the squares on board I could attack? You could define it as, what are the squares on board I have worse play than my opponent? Um, there's a whole bunch of ways to define that, and I'm not sure how I want to think about it yet. The third question is, what does my opponent intend? And I think that's a pretty useful one. And I think what are the weaknesses is, however you define it, is probably kind of useful. But I want to figure out a way to define it where it's not just saying the obvious, right? It's not telling you, hey, maybe you should capture, because I think most people consider capturing in various spots, right? I want it to be saying something more than that, and I'm not sure what to quite translate it into for triple triad. If anyone has any ideas, let me know. And what does my opponent intend? I think is actually probably, I think it's useful, but not as useful as it sounds like it should be. Because the way calculation works in triple triad is fairly direct, and you don't have to go off the path with stuff. My thought process is the second question should be basically, what are the squares my opponent has more play than I do? Should be our version of what are the, should be sort of a combination, right? It's a combination of what are our weaknesses and what does our opponent intend, right? There's a square that's more useful to them than us. And keeping that in mind, I think is really useful, because I think most top level creative moves are found because someone went, hey, in every line I calculate, this square sucked for me. I'm going to get rid of this square. Maybe it's setting up something against it. I think Akiyama, he's on screen right now, but is very good at doing that. Maybe it's just occupying that square, just blocking it. My move doesn't have to do much else. I'm just removing a square my opponent has more play than I do, and leaving myself with more squares where I have play. I think that's probably where I want to go with what are the weaknesses question. And I probably just want these two questions. And I think those questions combined with kind of good fundamentals, right? Good kind of lock stuff in, set stuff up, that kind of thing, I think could be a real effective addition to those types of thinking. That's my hope anyway. So this was about what's the worst card, and maybe if I do another of these, it'll be about what squares does my opponent have more play in than I do. And actually, maybe we'll stay on this position a sec. What squares does the opponent have more play than we do? Well, 5, we have this really nice double capture. Obviously, 5 is a good square for us. 6 is a worse square, right? We don't really have 6 because they have 5 in response. Okay. But they don't necessarily have 6 either, because if they played 6, we'd probably play 5, flipping a boatload of stuff. So, okay. 5 and 6 are reasonable squares for us. 7, they have this plus wall back that makes it hard for us to go in 5. Our capture there is a bit clunky, and uses a card that seems like it lands better elsewhere. 7's a kind of bad square for us. 8 and 9 don't immediately interact with stuff, so I tend not to say we have to consider 8 and 9 that much, unless in like every line we calculate, we're like, if I go 5, they combo me from 8, right? Then I'd start considering 8 a relevant square to include here. But I would probably start with just 5, 6, and 7, and say if we compare how good our play in each of those squares is to how good our opponent's play is, 7's the worst square for us. So if we combine these two thoughts, we might combine into 2858 is the card I want to use, and 7 is the square I want to get rid of, right? 7 is the, and you also get to the square you want to get rid of through calculating things, right? You calculate, okay, I want to go 9, 5, 1, 9, and 6. But they combo me in 5. Okay, can I do something useful in 5? I want to go 9, 5, 1, 9, and 5. Oh, but that flips 4 such that if they combo in 7, they flip through. So I don't want to go 6 because of 5, and I don't want to go 5 because of 7. Can I go 7? And actually, this gets to basically how I thought while watching. I thought, okay, 2, 8, 5, 8, and 7. And then I thought, can they play 6, 8, 4, 6, and 8? And I completely missed that sets up 5, 5, 7, 9, and 5 because I'm a buffoon. So I sort of thought, okay, I don't want to go 6 because of 5. I might not. I might have skipped that step, but I don't want to go 5 because of 7. I also may have skipped that step. My thinking was not great, but okay, we can pretend I thought this way. No 6 because 5. No 5 because 7. No 7 because 8. Okay, 2, 8, 5, 8, and 8, and that ends up with the move I got to. But if you weren't a buffoon and you realized, hey, 7 is not well responded to by 8, you could stop the thinking there in 7 and make an even better move. So I think that might be another way of thinking that could productively lead to the excellent move Tezuka played. And once you're looking at 7, which card are you going to use there? Well, there's a good question you should ask yourself, right? We've done 6 doesn't work due to 5, 5 doesn't work due to 7. What should I put in 7? Well, what's my worst card? And I'm not saying this is some incredible, unfindable move or anything. I'm just saying this was a very good move that happened to win the game against a top level opponent. And I don't think it's what a beginner to intermediate player would play. But I think there are some questions you could ask that player or a strong player, and they would pretty quickly get to the move, right? And pretty reliably make it. And I think I would have played 2, 8, 5, 8, and 8, which is a worse move, but again, I can't add, so I came up with the best move for people who can't add, and Tezuka came up with the best move for people who can add, so good job, Tezuka. Alright, now I actually will end the video. I hope this is useful. I think it's an interesting concept to run with, and I think one that has real potential to be useful to people or be completely ignored. Could go either way. We'll see.